Hello everyone, and welcome to my podcast series, Into the Weird, The Witches of Britain, in which I'm going to share stories about the eerie, hidden parts of British history. What I want to do with this series is to tell the stories of the victims of witchcraft beliefs, and to combine what the historical record can tell us with a discussion of the victims' psychology and their interactions with the people that accused them. First of all, a tiny bit about me. I'm a 24-year-old history graduate, and I'm now a history teacher at a brilliant secondary school in Devon. I'm obviously therefore no academic, but what I want to do is share stories of ordinary people in our country's past. When I was at university, I focused on women and gender in early modern England, and since university, I've been more and more interested in how this overlaps with beliefs about religion and beliefs about witchcraft. Living in Devon, way out in the West Country, is absolutely perfect for this. I love where I live, because the West is considered to be an extraordinarily witchy place. In fact, new research shows that Cornwall, Devon, Somerset and Dorset may have experienced more witchcraft persecution than places we previously thought of as hotspots, like East Anglia. Now this creates a uniquely uncanny atmosphere shaped by local myth, legend and tradition. I'd love to hear your feedback and what I could do to improve, so if you have any comments, feel free to contact me on the social media in the description. This episode is going to focus on a topic that is close to me both personally and geographically, and that is the Bideford witches and the stories of the lives and deaths of Temperance Lloyd, Susanna Edwards and Mary Trembles. Now, I grew up in the isolated wilds of North Devon, about 7 miles from Bideford itself. I do remember spending a lot of time in Bideford as a child, having ice cream by the river, cycling along the Tarka Trail, and although I don't remember my mum saying much about the witches, I do remember, despite being about 7 years old, being struck by the uncanny atmosphere in the town. It's got these steep cobbled hills, these secluded little alleyways, and this very real feeling of being far away from the rest of the country that I assume existed in the 17th century, and I can certainly say persisted well into the early 2000s. Now later on I moved to Exeter, which I still live near, and I was always intrigued by the mural of the 3 witches on the wall near the library, and the plaque on the Norman castle commemorating the last 3 women to be hanged for witchcraft in this country. When I researched the case, I found out, pretty amazingly I think, that I have some distant connection to some of the supporting characters of the trials, like the mayor of Bideford at the time, John Gist. Now I think I went to primary school with one of his great-great-great-great-great-great-grandsons, and another one of his great-great-grandsons also ran a funeral company in a town called Torrington, which is near Bideford, which arranged my granny's funeral. Now to me, this tells us something about a delightfully small world, but it also tells me something about the comparative isolation of a place like North Devon, which hasn't had huge influxes of different groups of people compared to other parts of the country, or even other parts of the county. For this narrative, I'm hugely indebted to the excellent book by John Callow, The Last Witches of England, which allowed me to develop this narrative of the Bideford witches, and also provided me with some tremendous analysis on the case. Now, with all that being said, let's actually get into the stories of the 3 women who've become known as the Bideford witches. Chapter 1. The Town of Bideford. Bideford in the 1680s was a strange place. It was a town of great contrasts in terms of religion, wealth and its geography. At the time of the Bideford witches, it was a port town with sea links to South Wales, Europe and North America. Nonetheless, it's pretty isolated from the rest of the country. It's at least 2 days' ride to the county town of Exeter, and it's not en route to anywhere else. I can speak from experience about the size of Devon. If you drive up towards Bideford today, you're struck by the beauty of the rolling hills of Devon, but you're also struck by the large distances and open country between villages and towns. Now consider its remoteness in the 17th century, with poor road links and still over 200 years before the first railway was constructed to the town. The town itself is situated on 2 steep hills on the banks of the River Torridge, and comprised of a jumble of elegant townhouses belonging to rich businessmen and the gentry, such as Charles II's favourite, the Earl of Bath, and ramshackle hovels inhabited by the town's poor, with rambling gardens perched on steep hillsides. In Bideford there wasn't much gentrification of areas. The eye-wateringly rich and the desperately poor lived side by side and encountered each other on the town's streets every day. I want you to come with me to Bideford in 1682. The air is filled with the stench of animal and human waste which flowed down the hills to the river. Precarious stacks of wood and dry bracken tottered on street corners, ready to be used as fuel for the fires of the town's inhabitants. It was a claustrophobic town where the proximity of people to each other meant that the people of the town generally knew each other's business. Rumours spread unchecked, and people could very easily spy on their neighbours. Continuing in the theme of contrasts, Bideford was also a particularly economically divided town. There was a growing fishing industry in which hardy local men would spend whole winters trawling for cod in the icy waters of Newfoundland and return with a tasty profit, some for themselves and most for the local owners of vessels such as the Willing Mind, the Nightingale and the Consent. Later on, the growth of tobacco plantations in Virginia and the Carolinas brought additional wealth to the town and continued to deplete the town of many of its young men. This economic development created a number of newly rich people who were very, very anxious to establish their positions in the town as gentlemen and were insecure about losing their hard-earned wealth. This created a transient population which swelled when ships returned and slumped when scores of young men were at sea, leaving many homes and young families without fathers and husbands. These changes also created a climate where economic contribution to the town was a marker of success, and those who relied on the charity of others and begged on Bideford streets were marked out as failures. If these unfortunates were women past childbearing age, it's highly likely that they were considered an encumbrance and an economic burden on the newly rich townsfolk. This created a fairly unique set of circumstances in which competition, envy, and insecurity flourished, and the traditional bonds of community and mutual support were frayed and often snapped in harder times. But now, without delay, it's time to meet the three women who later became known as the Bideford Witches. Chapter 2. Temperance, Susanna and Mary. According to accounts from the time, Temperance Lloyd was the leading figure among the three Bideford witches. Temperance Jones was probably born around 1620 in South Wales and arrived in Bideford with her family in the 1640s as a young woman in her 20s, hopeful of a bright future in an unfamiliar place. The 1640s witnessed a huge influx of immigrants from the valleys of South Wales to mine the seams of anthracite in the town, and her father, William Jones, was one such person. Her early years in Bideford must have been relatively happy and successful. Her family were employed, and she found love in the form of another Welsh immigrant, Rhys Lloyd, whom she married in late October 1648. Through this marriage, she may have thought she had cemented her position in Bideford society, happily married to a man with a steady job, linking two expatriate families in a network of reciprocal support. Further happiness would come in 1649 with the birth of a daughter, Joanna, a son, William, born in 1651, and a second son, Thomas, born in 1655. In doing this, she became what people of the time thought of as the perfect example of a woman, being the wife of a man who contributed to the prosperity of the town and a mother to several children. I like to think that the years after Temperance's marriage were times of happiness and relative plenty. The second woman who later on came to be known as one of the Bideford witches was Susanna Edwards. She was a Bideford native, born as the illegitimate daughter of Rachel Winslade in 1612. Her family was more abnormal by early modern standards, with 3 generations of illegitimate children, and her grandfather's house known as a bit of an odd place where unfortunate young women would go and give birth and try and escape from some of the stigma of their intensely moralist neighbours. Despite this inauspicious start to life, she also carved out a perfectly happy and respectable existence, marrying Davy Edwards in 1639, who was employed and able to provide for his young family. And, like Temperance, Susanna also experienced the joy of young children, bringing 3 sons and 3 daughters into the world between 1645 and 1657. Mary Trembles is the third of the supposed witches, and the figure that is least known about. Unlike Susanna and Temperance, she doesn't appear to have been a mother, and had the shortest history of the 3 women within the town. Instead, she arrived with her parents, Trojan and Honora Trembles, who were Anglo-Irish Protestants in the 1660s. After arriving, she may have experienced a degree of pleasure with the support of her family and the excitement of experiencing a totally new environment. Sadly for Temperance, the wheel of fortune had begun to reverse by the 1650s. In 1652, her father died. The anthracite mine was exhausted by 1655, which left many of the new Welsh immigrants unemployed. Her brother and his family left the town in May 1655, and she suffered the significant trauma of the abandonment of her husband Rhys and her children by the 1660s. This meant that by the mid-1660s, she was now a poor, abandoned, ageing woman approaching 50, with no means to support herself. She presumably lived in a hovel in the poor street of Cock Lane, with very little furniture, warmth, or means of comfort. She was only able to survive by scraping a meagre living by relying on the poor relief provided by local charities such as the John Andrew Dole, as well as direct aid from wealthier neighbours, whom she was humiliatingly forced to accost in the street and go door to door for their scraps and morsels. Robin Briggs has identified that people who were particularly at risk of witchcraft accusations were the dependent poor, including those in receipt of regular alms. So, for Temperance Lloyd, she very sadly fit this profile completely. The same sad reversal of fortune can also be observed in the life of Susanna Edwards. She was dealt the blow of losing a newborn in 1646, and she lost her youngest child, Richard, who was only 4 years old, in 1661. As a father myself, it's impossible to even consider the stress and the extreme pain that such an event would cause. On top of this, her husband Davy died in 1662, and her eccentric yet supportive grandfather John Winslade died in 1668. In these events, her domestic contentment was comprehensively shattered, and she was left with no support network to speak of within Bideford. Now, getting married again was the normal response that people at the time took to this kind of adversity, but this was less available for women. In fact, around half of the women accused of witchcraft across Europe were widows, of whom a fair number appeared to have had no surviving children. Even before her husband's death, the family had also been forced to rely on the John Andrew Dole in 1658, presumably due to the exhaustion of the mine and the limited employment opportunities for former miners. After her husband's death, similar to Temperance, she had to rely on outside poor relief, as well as the charity of neighbours. However, unlike Temperance, she was more able to form relationships with other unfortunate women and go begging in the streets of Bideford together. One such woman was Mary Trembles. Now she also had to deal with the double calamity of deaths in the family, this time of her father and her mother. Her father Trojan died in May 1671, and her mother, Honora, died just over a year later. With no recourse to employment, Mary had to rely on the support of the parish and begging alongside other women. In this, she assumed a subservient role, easily dominated by other women. This might be due to the fact that she was unfamiliar with the town and its people, having to rely on the local knowledge of other unfortunates. However, wealthier people, of whom Bideford had a growing number, tended to see the begging poor as a serious threat to law and order. Groups of beggars gave rise to the rhetoric of the sturdy beggar, a figure who chose not to work and resorted to tricks and deception so as to live off the wealth of others. In the early modern period, the unfortunate poor increasingly came to be seen as at best a parasitic nuisance and at worst a genuine threat to public safety. This meant that by the 1670s, the reversal of the wheel of fortune was complete for all three women. Instead of being supported by husbands or families, they relied on the charity of others, in a town where acts of charity increasingly generated resentment. By the mid-1660s, all three women would have begged year-round in Bideford streets, whereas in winters of previous years they would have enjoyed the warmth of a hearth, a full stomach, and the company of their families. They now endured long, cold nights begging in the streets, whipped by the bitterly cold winds off the Atlantic and scorned by other inhabitants. Their increasing age, poor diet, and personal blows must have taken a toll on the physical and mental health of all three. They were now intensely vulnerable, relying on the goodwill of others just to survive, abandoned by their families, and almost totally alone in the world. Chapter 3. The Meetings with the Devil. In the eyes of the law, the increasing poverty and the increasing desperation of Temperance, Susanna and Mary made them easy targets for the devil's temptation. Now, before going any further, I think it's really important to say that the evidence that we have about their dealings with the devil come from trial records and they come from pamphlets, which were constructed, shaped and even adapted by literate members of the elite. And they also deal with stories of vulnerable older women under extreme stress who discuss literally meeting and interacting with Satan. So, I think most of you listeners will be able to take what they say with a pinch of salt. But I think it's worth exploring how each of the three women imagined their relationship with the devil, because it gives us some valuable clues about their wants and about their desires in the face of the vicious adversity that they experienced in their lives. On the 30th of September, 1381, Temperance Lloyd claimed she met the devil. I want you to come with me to Gunstone Lane, the location where Temperance first met the devil. Gunstone Lane remains a strangely atmospheric street, and it's well worth a visit. Although I'm not an expert, it seems to not have changed much from its early modern past. It's on a steep cobbled hill, it's dark and it's remote, and it's hemmed in closely on each side by small cottages. It's not hard to imagine a place where one might meet a mysterious stranger emerging from a low doorway under a cloud of smoke in the morning gloam. Nevertheless, Temperance Lloyd's initial description of the devil is more comical than threatening. She claimed that the devil appeared to her in the form of a small creature who offered to help her carry the bundle of firewood she was dragging up the street. She described Satan as about the length of her arm, with very big eyes, who capered about her, hopping or leaping in the way before her as she walked up the street, with blackish clothes and a mouth like a toad. After the devil came with her to her hovel, he began to suck her teats, which she hath now in her secret parts, and afterwards he did suck her again as she was lying down, and that his sucking was with a great pain unto her, and afterwards vanished clear away out of sight. This is actually a seriously abnormal description of an interaction with the devil compared to other records from early modern witch trials. The devil seems to be more similar to a familiar spirit, and instead of being a familiar spirit that Temperance could control, in this case, the fairy was the one giving Temperance the orders. To underline this even further, the devil offered no material gain to his relationship with Temperance. In most cases, women who confessed to witchcraft usually stressed the newfound power that they had been granted, and claimed that they were enticed with promises of wealth and promises of glory. Instead, the devil simply exploited Temperance and bossed her around. These interactions with the devil might reflect the extreme lack of power and autonomy that Temperance felt in her own life. Her poverty and her social exclusion meant that she couldn't even imagine being granted money, power, and comfort. Perhaps it was because of the ridiculous implausibility of her account that it was reworked later by the local reverend who visited Temperance when she was languishing in the depths of Exeter Castle's dungeon long after her arrest. This reverend, Francis Han, tied the account of Temperance's temptation much more closely to popular ideas of how the devil dealt with witches. Instead of meeting in the middle of town, the devil was now said to have met her in a field outside of Bideford, somewhere a bit more remote, in which witnesses were less likely to have witnessed the meeting. And instead of being a comical imp figure, the devil became a mysterious man dressed in black with cloven hooves, who now, this time, did offer Temperance the chance of wealth and glory, and vanished into a puff of sulphurous smoke in the morning mist. Remarkably, nobody at the time thought it was sensible to check why Temperance's account of her meeting had changed so much. Compared to Temperance, Susanna Edwards provides a far more textbook account of meeting Satan, in terms of conforming to early modern ideas about how the devil recruited witches. She claimed that when gathering wood to make a fire, so as to give her some warmth and comfort on the cold dark night, in a field a gentleman approached her, offering her the chance of riches and glory, provided she entered into a formal agreement with him. The devil inquired whether she was a poor woman, unto whom she answered that she was a poor woman, and that thereupon the devil in the shape of the gentleman did say unto her that if this examinant would grant him one request, that she should neither want for meat, drink, nor clothes. Mary Tremble's confession echoes Susanna's, in that she claimed that Susanna came to her with the offer to become rich as a result of a demonic pact. After striking this bargain, the devil did come to her in the shape of a lion and had carnal knowledge of her body. Put simply, this means that she had sex with the devil. The fact that her account conforms more closely to typical confessions of meeting the devil from the period makes complete sense, as these accounts of her meeting the devil were encouraged and shaped by a mysterious local chancer called John Dunning, who visited Susanna and Mary in prison soon after they'd been arrested, presumably hoping to make a name for himself, who coloured their accounts so as to make a conviction more likely and propel him to becoming a minor local celebrity. It's not hard to understand why in the minds of the people of Bideford, Temperance Lloyd, Susanna Edwards and Mary Trembles were such willing dupes for the devil. Abandoned, consistently excluded, and in desperate need to settle scores that they had accrued in their years begging the streets, they were the perfect instruments for the devil to bring chaos and disorder to the streets of newly prosperous Bideford. Chapter 4. The Crimes of the Witches. Temperance, Susanna and Mary had an unfortunate trait of making enemies. Of course, they weren't helped by the unique context of the town, in which quarrels ran and ran, divisions split the town into competing factions, and people were obsessively insecure about their wealth. But their inability to get on well with their neighbours certainly contributed to their eventual arrests on witchcraft charges. Temperance's demise was confirmed by 4 examples of working harmful magic on other Bideford residents. Her rap sheet stretched far back to 1671 and the family of a local farmer, William Herbert. In the grips of a smallpox epidemic, several young children of the Herbert family died. Further tragedy struck when the head of the household, William, was killed. Temperance's reputation as a belligerent beggar was already sufficiently tainted that William claimed on his deathbed that Temperance Lloyd was responsible for his death. His son and namesake pressed the local authorities into action, and Temperance was carried away to await trial at the Spring Assizes in Exeter. William Herbert the Younger's claim that his father had been killed by Temperance Lloyd was bolstered by a faintly ridiculous claim made by Lydia Berman. Berman believed that in her kitchen, Temperance had appeared unto her in the shape of a red pig. This unforeseen invasion of her domestic space by a slightly threatening animal was enough to convince her that she had been the victim of a supernatural assault. Quite why she linked this instance to an old beggar woman from the town is completely unclear, although John Callow provides a convincing comparison between the actions of a semi-wild pig scavenging for scraps on the outlying cottages of Bideford and Temperance's daily quest for sustenance, going door to door from her neighbours in the hope of some nourishment. Thankfully for Temperance, she had the presence of mind to deny all charges against her at her trial, and the jury was unconvinced of her guilt. The trial ended in her acquittal and her return to the streets of Bideford. Her return was far from triumphant, however, as many of the Bideford townsfolk remained convinced of her guilt. So empty was her stomach, and so meagre was the charity that she had received, that as she roamed the streets of Bideford, she felt the only way she'd be able to gain enough food or money to sustain herself was to threaten others with a curse if they weren't generous enough. Of course, this approach to begging did little to endear her to the townsfolk, and this was exemplified by a case from 1679 involving an apple and a child. 6-year-old Anne Fellow and her mother were strolling down the high street of Bideford in the weak sunshine of a late spring day in Devon. There they passed the hunched figure of Temperance Lloyd, bedecked in dark rags, sitting behind a small barrel of apples that she had hoped to sell to supplement her meagre income. An apple meant nothing to the child, yet it meant everything to Temperance. Spurred on by the obliviousness of youth, Anne nonchalantly grabbed an apple and followed her mother down the street. Outraged, Temperance demanded payment, to which the mother cruelly scoffed. What followed was an unedifying scene of Temperance harassing the pair as they hurried away up the steep street. Quite what the other people of Bideford made of the spectacle of Temperance pursuing a child and her mother through the streets of Bideford, yelling curses and threatening demonic retribution is hard to tell. Further bad news was to come in 1680, when Anne Fellow died of the smallpox. Robin Briggs has written about how the unexpected deaths of beloved children often catalysed wild anguish on the part of the parents, who often channeled these feelings of unfathomable pain into witchcraft accusations. Unfortunately for Temperance, it appeared that her curses had been actuated. This confirmed to many what they already thought they knew about Temperance. Temperance wasn't helped by the form that her begging took. She actively invited other residents of the town to see her as a witch, as part of a pathetic attempt to increase the yields of her begging. Grace Thomas was another woman at her wits' end. For some time, Grace had been bedridden with an unknown illness in the house of her sister's new husband, Thomas Eastchurch, an insecure merchant who was eager to preserve his newly found wealth and style himself as an upstanding member of the town's elite. For more nights than she had cared to count, Grace had writhed in agony in the pregnant darkness of her four-poster bed, tormented by unseen terrors and pains in her abdomen, as her sister and brother-in-law searched vainly for a cure. In September 1681, during a period of brief respite from her torment, with the novel chill of an early autumn night and the light fading, she had chosen to stroll through the streets. Due to the fact that the dwellings of Bideford's patrician class and the ramshackle houses of the town's indigent poor had been constructed cheek by jowl, she was confronted by the shambling figures of Bideford's less fortunate as she took her walk. One such figure stood out. Prostrated and weeping in the road in front of her lay Temperance Lloyd. "I'm so glad to see you again, Miss Grace." Startled by the over-familiarity of a woman who, if she knew, she only knew very distantly, she replied, "Why dost thou weep for me?" Perhaps hoping to ingratiate herself and earn a few extra pennies from her comparatively rich counterpart, Temperance replied, "I'm so glad to see you again." Grace hurried away, shaken by the strange interaction. In subsequent nights, ensconced in the private terror and pain of her bedchamber, she must have dwelt on Temperance's words further. Worse was to come in the next summer, when the eerie and taunting object of a child's doll was inexplicably found in her room. This seemed to be an especially cruel taunt to Grace, as a woman without children, of marrying age, who relied on the support of her sister's husband. To Grace it appeared that a symbol which represented the joy of children was being used to mock her unhappy, childless existence. Her sister's husband, the young merchant, Thomas Eastchurch, remembered seeing a tabby cat take the doll from his shop downstairs and carry it up the stairs to Grace's room. As the family gathered around Grace's bed, their faces lit by the flickering lights of the candles, with the stench of sickness hanging heavy in the air, they connected the dots in their heads and came to the same conclusion. Temperance Lloyd had bewitched Grace. She was the cause of Grace's agonizing pains and fits, and it was Temperance who had shifted into the shape of a cat to deposit the doll in Grace's room as a cruel taunt to her victim. Temperance's fate was sealed by an extraordinary case of bad luck. One morning, as Grace's servants, Anne Wakely and Honor Hooper, tried to remove the pall of sickness from the house, they were airing out her room. A magpie perched itself in the open window, spying a shiny trinket in the gloom of the chamber. The magpie swooped for its prize, and the servant girls, in the grips of the house's collective neurosis about curses and demonic magic, were startled by the unexpected intruder. Their screams must have scared the magpie, who flew back out the window he had entered from. This commotion led Grace's pains to return instantly, and as she cried out, Thomas Eastchurch ordered all the windows and doors closed to ensure no further incursions into the safety of the house. Fortune was exceptionally cruel to Temperance on this morning. As these events were playing out upstairs, her stooping figure was trudging down the same street, on her daily round begging from the houses of the town's more affluent residents. Clothed in rags, her face tear-stained and caked in dirt, she must have looked every inch the demonic harridan that had been constructed in the collective imagination of Thomas Eastchurch's household. Just as the startled magpie flew out of the upstairs window, Temperance was hunched next to the front door. The servant who had been instructed to shut the door was startled by the beggar woman's unexpected presence on the threshold of the sanctity of the house, and rushed to tell Thomas and Grace. Every single unfortunate event, from the strange interaction in the street, to the doll, to the magpie, to Temperance lingering on the doorstep, to Grace's mysterious and inexplicable illness, as well as the reputation Temperance had acquired, they all became linked in the minds of the Eastchurch family, and they resolve to track down Temperance, arrest her, and put her to death for the crime of witchcraft. Susanna Edwards and Mary Trembles weren't much better at begging than Temperance. They too were forced to eke out a lean existence, surviving on the scraps from the tables of Bideford's more fortunate families. Unlike Temperance, they formed something of a friendship between each other in a desperate attempt to increase the yields of their begging, and in doing so they created an unstable and rudimentary support network. While this may have allowed them to pool the fruits of their begging, this meant that they were also implicitly in competition for resources, so quarrels between them were frequent. Their friendship had already begun to unravel in the spring of 1682. However, much like Temperance, Susanna's reputation as a witch in the town predated the year of her arrest. Dorcas Coleman was the young wife of one of Bideford's sailors, whose job took him to the distant waters of Newfoundland to catch cod for half of the year. This left Dorcas alone in the family home. Her fears about the source of her mysterious affliction ripened in the stifling stillness of countless meals for one. Dorcas Coleman was another woman afflicted by a mysterious illness for which local doctor George Beer could diagnose no cause other than magic. I often find that when alone, your thoughts can creep up on you, and it appears that her illness and isolation led her to desperately scour her memory for somebody she may have offended. Her suspicion immediately fell upon the old beggar woman who disturbed her empty home on her daily begging round, Susanna Edwards. When her husband had returned from his voyage, Dorcas managed to convince him to help her break Susanna Edwards' paranormal hold over her and hopefully end her suffering. Therefore, when Susanna arrived at the door to beg for some crumbs from the Coleman table, John surprisingly let Susanna enter the building and invited her up to his wife's bedroom. As Susanna entered the room, the sickly Dorcas leapt from her bed and frantically tried to scratch the old woman's face. This wasn't a random manifestation of months of torment causing a victim to attack their supposed tormentor. It was a commonly held belief that you could break a witch's power by drawing their blood. Unfortunately for Dorcas, and paradoxically unfortunately for Susanna, weeks of bed rest had wasted Dorcas' muscles away, and she was unable to reach Susanna's face. This strange and unexpected attack caused an understandably bewildered Susanna to flee the house. Nobody was satisfied. Susanna left the house, confused and still under the suspicion of being a witch. Dorcas's attempt to break Susanna's curse had failed, and her resentment and her outrage smouldered, waiting for the appropriate time to confront Susanna again about her supposed crime. 2 years later, in 1682, yet again, Susanna and Mary woke on an empty stomach. They set out for the home of John Barnes, a rich local yeoman who had previously been generous to the two women, in the hope of begging some bread and some meat. They were to be bitterly disappointed, however, when they found that John Barnes was not at home, and they were instead confronted by his wife, Grace Barnes, who refused to give them any meat or drink, and angrily sent the pair packing. Seething at the seeming injustice of the interaction, and being the more dominant of the two women, Susanna sent Mary back to the Barnes household later in the day, hoping that John Barnes would have returned. This was a terrible decision. The request this time was for a farthing's worth of tobacco. Once again the door was opened by Grace Barnes, whose irate shrieks once again drove Mary Trembles away from the door and drew people's attention to the melodrama playing out on the cobbled street. This uncomfortable scene provides us with a textbook example of a psychological response to begging, explained well by Robin Briggs, called refusal guilt syndrome. Those who refused charity felt at once angry and they felt guilty. Then they projected their own feelings onto the person who they had refused to give to. If the rejection was followed by a misfortune, the supposed ill will became witchcraft. Unfortunately for Susanna and Mary, this is exactly what happened. Like Grace Thomas and Dorcas Coleman, Grace Barnes was also afflicted by chronic pain for which no cure could be found. It's certainly possible that in a small town like Bideford, three women of moderate yet not insubstantial status would have been aware of each other's illnesses and come to the same conclusion about their causes. Grace Barnes then consulted a local apothecary, Oliver Bull, a relatively unskilled man who diagnosed the cause of her illness as witchcraft. This is something of a cop-out on his part, as it meant he'd not have to demonstrate any skill in further identification or curing of her illness. This also meant that Grace Barnes was frantically searching for people who may have held a grudge against her, and her mind settled on the decrepit and persistent figures who in her mind kept appearing inexplicably on the threshold of her domestic space. There was a considerable degree of misunderstanding between Susanna and Grace in terms of the purpose of Susanna's presence at Grace's house, which reflected the growing wealth divide in Bideford. While Grace Barnes saw the visits as unnecessary and threatening, Susanna and Mary would have seen the visits as an essential part of their daily struggle to sustain themselves. Now, along with the usual smell of the salt coming off the sea, some of the residents of Bideford could detect another smell faintly on the Atlantic breeze. The smell of sulphur. Witchery was afoot in Bideford, and the townsfolk now felt a responsibility to track down the witches and bring them to justice. Susanna and Mary's last hours of freedom were spent frantically wandering the streets and bickering about who was responsible for their cruel fate. In much the same way as with Temperance, their conspicuous and persistent approach to begging had made easy enemies of other townsfolk and allowed a reputation for witchcraft to incubate over a period of years. Reputations as witches built up over a long space of time. They were not usually the result of a singular event. Temperance, Susanna and Mary also had the misfortune of being thrown up against 3 sickly and chronically anxious women. Their eventual arrest on Monday the 17th of July probably came as no great surprise to them or other townsfolk. Like Temperance, they were locked up in the town jail to await questioning. Chapter 5. My sins be as red as scarlet. The cold flagstones of the town's lockup were of little comfort to Temperance Lloyd. As she lay in the frosty darkness, it's unlikely that Temperance genuinely convinced herself that she'd met the devil in Gunstone Lane. Nevertheless, she must have felt waves and waves of sadness and isolation buffet her fitful half-sleep. Abandoned by her family, any possibility of somebody speaking out in her defence had become improbable, borderline impossible. She knew well the view that the people of Bideford had formed of her, and no stranger to witchcraft trials, she must have had a decent idea of how the forthcoming days would play out. As Temperance lay alone on the floor of the lockup, the mayor of Bideford, Thomas Gist, sprang into action. He commissioned Anne Wakely and Honor Hooper to conduct the body search in an attempt to locate the witch's mark. The witch's mark would have been a small red spot, a blue spot, or a dangling strip of flesh, which proved that the devil had suckled the witch as a means of confirming their diabolical pact. In choosing these 2 women to perform this task, Thomas Gist abandoned all semblance of impartiality. Now, I've introduced you to Anne Wakely and Honor Hooper previously in this story. They were the servants, the confidants, and the housemates of Temperance's principal accuser and main detractor, Grace Thomas. How Thomas Gist expected 2 women steeped in the furtive conspiracy and outright neuroses of Grace Thomas's household to complete an impartial examination of Temperance to determine her guilt is very hard to fathom. Tragically, it's likely he didn't care and wanted the case resolved as quickly as possible. The rough, humiliating and degrading examination of a naked, bewildered and unhappy old woman was carried out, and Anne Wakely and Honor Hooper duly located the witch's mark without too much trouble. The mark in question was a stalk-like growth inside Temperance's vagina, which had been identified today as cervical polyps, a relatively common and innocuous growth in postmenopausal women. Ironically, at the time this was occurring, ideas of witches' marks, which were born in the tumult of the Civil War and the vicious East Anglian witch hunts of the days of Matthew Hopkins, were increasingly being challenged by enlightened physicians like John Webster, who provides an excellent quote attacking the discovery of witches' marks as the basis of conviction. He said, "There are diverse nodes, knots, protuberances, warts, and excrescences that grow upon the bodies of men and women. Some have them from their mother's wombs, some grow afterwards, some proceed from internal causes, some from external hurts. Some are soft, some hard, some pendulous, some fistulous, some hollow and indolent. And they are more frequent in some persons by reason of their complexion and constitution, and others by reason of their age, sex, and other accidents, especially in women that are old, or by reason of childbirth and the like. Now if all these were witches' marks, then few would go free, especially those that are of the poorer sort, that have the worst diet and are nastily kept, and it is a woeful error to make that sign a mark of a diabolical contract. Where is the coherence, connection, or just consequence? Nevertheless, it appears that nobody in Bideford knew or cared for such trivialities, and the humiliation of the examination was too strong, and the veneer of fairness too thin for Temperance to protest anew. She duly confessed to her interrogators to all that was posed to her. She had met the devil, been sucked by him. She had been the tabby cat who placed the doll on Grace's bed. She had been the cause of Grace's suffering, and the magpie at the window had been the devil himself. As Temperance was carted away from Bideford for the last time for her 2-day journey to Exeter to await trial, she must have glanced back at the town. A single tear snaked its way down her face, black with the grime of 20 years of poverty, struggle, and abandonment. She had experienced genuine happiness in her youth in the town, and yet, as she aged, the town had grown and changed as well. She had been progressively ostracised, isolated, and literally demonised. Now, without a friend to speak for her, having confessed to her crimes, she knew that the game was up, and that she was not long for this world. Susanna Edwards and Mary Trembles went less quietly. Sadly, they focused most of their energy on arguing with each other in the town lockup about who was responsible for their sad predicament, rather than refuting allegations against them. Like Temperance, they both quickly confessed to meeting and making a pact with the devil. It's highly likely that when confronted by learned, literate men who were already convinced of their guilt, they simply acquiesced to their barrack demands for confession as part of a pathetically deferential attempt to please their accusers and social superiors. Susanna took this opportunity to fit the profile of the perfect witch way too far in the Bideford courtroom, however. She sealed hers and Mary's fate with a ridiculously short-sighted admission that Mary Trembles was her servant and that she herself was a servant of the devil. She was clearly enjoying the attention and fear that she provoked in others, which she had sorely lacked in her unhappy life. She admitted to pinching and pricking Grace Barnes in order to torment her, and when demonstrating how this worked, the wide-eyed Bideford resident, Anthony Jones, cried out, "Thou devil, thou art now tormenting some person or another." Enjoying being the centre of attention for once, Susanna hastily replied, "Well enough, I will fit thee." The wimpish and faintly pathetic spectacle followed, of Anthony Jones writhing on the floor of the courtroom, like people pretending to have a heart attack, I imagine, having convinced himself that he was the latest victim of Susanna's enchantment. The absurd psychodrama of the Bideford courtroom, as well as Susanna and Mary's full confessions, was enough for John Gist, the mayor, to send them away to join Temperance in the gloomy bowels of Exeter Castle to await trial at the summer assizes. While awaiting trial, Temperance Lloyd seems to have picked up where Susanna Edwards left off in making the most of her newfound infamy. When visited by Bideford's local reverend, the fame-hungry egoist Francis Han, she not only changed her confession to make it more believable to the jury, but boasted that she had personally intervened to stop the devil from assaulting the reverend. In much the same way as Susanna, she hugely miscalculated in making her boasts, overplaying her hand and confirming to everybody what they thought they already knew about her. Similarly, when crowds of curious onlookers thronged outside their windows, each of the three witches played up their roles in bewitching others and the powers that they possessed. The chattering of a terrified and ferociously inflamed local populace fed back into the courtroom and built further resentment towards the three supposed witches. Through their boastful confessions, there was now no reasonable doubt that they had committed the crimes, and the judge and jury were confronted by a crowd baying for blood. The trial itself was a short affair. Although we lack the trial records, what does survive is a wealth of correspondence regarding the trial produced by its key players. An eyewitness to the trial, Sir Francis North, one of the circuit court judges, reported on the trial by letter to the Secretary of State, Leoline Jenkins. Sir Francis North offered an embarrassed justification for the executions of the woman in his letter. The evidence against them was very full and fanciful, but their own confessions exceeded it. They appeared not only weary of their own lives, but to have a great deal of skill to convict themselves. "Sir, I find the country so fully possessed against them, that though some of the virtuosi may think that these things are the effects of melancholy or delusion, yet we cannot reprieve them without appearing to deny the very being of witches, which, as it is, contrary to law, so I think it would be ill for his Majesty's service, for it may give the faction occasion to set afoot the old trade of witch-finding, that may cost many innocent persons their lives, in which this justice will prevent. In making this claim, Sir Francis North discarded any pretence of rational objectivity. Instead, the mob's bloodlust had to be satiated in order to prevent popular disorder in the West. It didn't matter to North that the 3 innocent women would be sent to the gallows. Their certain deaths had now become a matter of political expedience rather than justice. It also reflects the desperately poor mental state of the women on trial, who had evidently been worn down by their imprisonment, relentless interrogation, and years of pain, who appeared to all onlookers to be borderline suicidal. The frenzy of the trial died down in the 6 days that the women had to wait for their sentence to be carried out. It's hard to know whether when they awaited their deaths in the dingy dungeon beneath Exeter Castle, Temperance, Susanna and Mary reflected on a time in their lives where they may have enjoyed a semblance of happiness. Temperance and Susanna in their marriages and the joy of young children. Mary in the time she spent with her parents in her 20s, soon after moving to Bideford. When the day came, Temperance and Mary reacted in very different ways. Mary panicked at the thought of what was to come, and had to be tied to the back of a horse to be carried to the site of execution. Temperance, whose existence had been marked by a constant lack of food, made the most of her final meal, and finished the scraps of the 2 other women, so she did not die on an empty stomach. As the horses carrying the condemned cut an uneven and halting path through the howling mob, and the bleak construction of the gallows came into their view, the reality of their situation perhaps finally sunk in for all 3 women. In their final moments on earth, Temperance, Susanna and Mary did something extraordinary. If they'd summoned up the courage to do this in the weeks leading up to these last moments, then they were unlikely to have been condemned to die. With their feet on the scaffold, the coarse fibres of rope around their necks, one after another they retracted their confessions. Of course, it was far too late to save them, but in this final act of defiance, they confounded their accusers and gained a degree of dignity and poise which had eluded them in the autumn of their lives. Finally, in the sunshine of a late summer day, our story concludes. One after another, the women climbed the ladder before being pushed off to swing and choke. Aware of the judgment awaiting her after her feet had left the wooden rungs, Susanna Edwards uttered her final words. "My sins be as red as scarlet, but the Lord Jesus can make them as white as snow." Chapter 6. The Legacy of the Bideford Witches. In less than 350 years, the 3 women who were put to death on that late summer's day have gone from being reviled as figures of mockery, embarrassment, and the embodiment of diabolical evil to 3 proto-feminist icons who are today celebrated as victims of a callous, misogynist, and backward era of Britain's history. So, how did this happen? Well, prior to, during, and in the immediate years in the aftermath of the trials, elite opinion was already souring towards the belief in the potential of ordinary people making pacts with the devil to cause harm. The general belief in God shifted from an all-powerful, angry, interventionist active figure who smote sinners on a daily basis to more of a transcendent figure whose divine plan governed the world. As a result, the belief that the devil played an active role in causing everyday misfortune lost a bit of popularity. No longer would it be realistic to blame the devil for butter not churning, children sickening, or animals going lame. Think about how we react to mishaps in our lives today. It would take a very quirky person indeed to blame everything that goes wrong for them on the mischief of the devil. In a 1696 trial, also at Exeter Castle, the case against Bet Horner was abandoned when a supposedly bewitched child's mother protested that her daughter had walked up a 9-foot-high wall backwards and forwards. It's entertaining to imagine the courtroom erupting into sniggers at witness testimony which contradicted common sense and the laws of physics. These examples reflect that conviction rates for witchcraft offences were plummeting in the years after the trials of Temperance, Susanna and Mary. Juries were now far more likely to acquit under the direction of judges who were increasingly inculcated in Enlightenment values. Popular opinion was a bit slower to change. In fact, unfortunate women and men continued to be scratched or swum in an attempt to break their hold over others or prove their pact with Satan. Even in the mid-1820s, 67-year-old Suffolk peddler Isaac Stebbings was brutally ducked in freezing water for 45 minutes in front of fellow villagers. It was only really from the 1940s onwards that popular attitudes that people had the capacity to harm others through a pact with the devil began to decrease in Britain. It's actually doubtful that such ideas have definitively disappeared, particularly with the satanic panic of the 1990s and the obsession with the American right with unchristian values disseminated by agents of the deep state, including teachers like myself. Nevertheless, there is evidence that popular opinion had begun to shift, even before the trials of Temperance, Susanna and Mary. This is epitomised by a story from a witchcraft trial at Taunton Castle in 1676, in which the judge recalled being accosted by a hideous old woman, his words not mine, whose son had just been acquitted, who shouted, "My lord, 40 years ago they'd have hanged me for a witch, and they could not, and now they would have hanged my poor son." These positive changes effectively ended an incredibly dark period in our country's history, in which the argumentative, belligerent and eccentric people who add colour and diversity to our 21st century experience could live in understandable fear of the vengeful mob. Tragically, these changes did not save Temperance, Susanna and Mary from the gallows. Perhaps it was a measure of their marginality, their abject poverty and lack of friends or family to speak for them that they should suffer the cruel fate of a painful and public death. Nevertheless, the miserable stories of lives of humiliating poverty, social exclusion and outright disgust that these women provoked in their fellow humans have been transformed. Their legacy lives on in the town of Bideford, the city of Exeter, and worldwide. They were referenced by the Labour Home Secretary of the time in the House of Commons in December 1950 in his speech in favour of repealing the 1735 Witchcraft Act as innocent victims of an implausible crime. In 1995, Judith Noble succeeded in getting a plaque erected on the ancient walls of Exeter Castle, which commemorates Temperance, Susanna and Mary, which remains there to this day. Beneath their names there is a succinct explanation of why the plaque exists, in the hope of an end to persecution and intolerance. Nearby, down an atmospheric alley that leads to Gandy Street, which was rumoured to be the inspiration for Diagon Alley, which is frequented by witches and wizards of a very different nature, is a mural of Exeter's history, with the three witches, replete with fictitious yet light-hearted pointy hats, centre stage, sitting around a bubbling cauldron. Perhaps most poignantly, in 2014, about a week before I started sixth form college at Exeter College, about 300 metres away, in Northern Hay Gardens on the anniversary of the witches' deaths, a witches' grand tea party was attended by around 400 people who gathered for a picnic, celebration and commemoration of the three witches of Bideford. To quote John Callow, "If in life Temperance Lloyd, Susanna Edwards and Mary Trembles enjoyed precious little rest, notice or contentment, and sparked only hatred, resentment and fear in those about them, then the patterns of their modern commemoration, which have been spontaneous, irreverent and joyous, suggest that against all the odds a victory of sorts was to be found in the laughter of their sisters and their children." I've sought to tell their story as a cautionary tale of the danger of othering those without the resources to defend themselves. Abandoned by a world that had treated them with despicable cruelty for most of their lives, Temperance Lloyd, Susanna Edwards and Mary Trembles died unhappy and reviled, completely ignorant of their later rehabilitation in the eyes of Devonians and the world. Nevertheless, their stories give us a powerful reminder of the dangers posed by mob justice, the role of political expediency in determining court verdicts, and othering the vulnerable, who often require the greatest amount of support.